Hello everyone, and welcome to yet another installment of Draco Sinister. So I don't think there's anything really crucial before I get started here, except to say that there was a semi-interesting plot device that was kind of used during this chapter that I ended up taking out because it was just kind of silly and arbitrary, but I thought I'd tell you guys about it anyway. So initially, Cassandra Clare had this thing about the rock quarry that's outside of the Weasley's house. And there was this brother that was born in between Percy and Charlie, and he had drowned in that quarry at one point. And because of that, Mr. and Mrs. Weasley had insisted that all of the Weasleys learn how to do what is the equivalent of wizarding CPR. So that part I took out, and you might see why in the reading, but I just wanted to let you know about it anyway, because it's interesting and kind of tragic and sad. But anyway, without further ado, let's just get right into it. Chapter 9. The River. "Sirius!" shouted Harry. "Sirius, where are you?" There was no answer, but at that moment he became aware of the sound of feet running behind him, and turned to see Ron. He was in his pajamas and barefoot, but running as fast as his long legs could carry him. He was holding his wand. Throwing himself down next to Harry at the edge of the quarry, he pointed his wand down into the quarry and asked in a breathy voice, "What's going on?" he demanded, breathless. "Malfoy fell in," said Harry tersely. "I can't do anything. Narcissus sent me here as an apparition. Ron, can you—" "Accio," Ron said firmly, and the water seemed to break open and turn itself inside out. Harry saw the water flash black, then silver, and then Draco's body flew up out of it, rose into the air, and landed between them on the grass, crumpling in on itself, like an abandoned toy. He thought experimentally, but could not cast the thought outward. It echoed into emptiness, as if he had thrown a ball and found that there was no one there to catch it. He looked at Ron. His face was very white in the moonlight, each freckle standing out like a separate ink dot. Check his pulse. Ron looked uncomfortable, but reached out to turn Draco over. His skin was bluish-white, not an encouraging color, and the lids of his eyelids were purple. Against his livid skin, the scar on his left hand stood out. Harry's heart sank. Ron pressed his fingers to Draco's throat, looked up and shook his head. "Nothing. No pulse," Harry echoed in disbelief. "But he can't have been down there that long." Ron looked up at Harry, and Harry saw the shock in his blue eyes. "Harry," he said unevenly, shivering in the cold night air. "He's dead. Drop your wand, Ron." "What?" "Put it down." Ron did. "Now, do exactly what I tell you." Ron was looking at Harry as if he were insane, and Harry was none too sure that he wasn't. He felt as if he were gripping very tightly onto something very slippery, felt as if he might lapse into hysterics at any moment, but knew he couldn't afford to. "All right," he said, enunciating each word with perfect precision. "Open his mouth." Ron did it, looking doubtfully at Harry as he did so. "Tilt his head back. Right, like that. Now, put your mouth on his and breathe into his lungs." Ron jerked back. "What? Just do it!" Okay. "Harry?" Draco tried to say, but his own voice made no sound. He opened his eyes, and for a moment wondered if he had gone blind. There was nothing but blackness. Holding out his hands, he shuffled forward into the darkness. There was no sound at all, no scent, no feel of heat or cold. He had always wondered if death was nothingness, and found that idea comforting. Now he realized how terrible nothingness could be. "Hurry, hurry, hurry, hurry," he called out. This time he heard his own voice, a soft echo. He followed the sound of it until he heard another sound, a soft trickle, like falling water. He threw his hand out, and this time it struck something hard, a wall. Feeling along it, he drew closer and closer to the sound of water, and at last saw a narrow band of light and realized it was the end of a tunnel. "They always said there'd be a light at the end of the tunnel," he thought grimly, "but somehow this isn't what I was expecting." He squeezed his way through the narrow gap in the stones and found himself standing on the bank of a swift-moving river. He stepped down into it, and the water swirled around his ankles. It was like wading through molasses. He glanced down and shouted in terror. There were faces under the water, white, staring faces with big, frog-like eyes that stared up at him accusingly. With a hoarse yell, he started to back away, but it was too late. A wet hand seized his ankle, long white fingers scrabbling for a hold on his trousers. A head, dark and sleek as a seal's, broke the water, and slowly a woman rose to her feet before him. Her hair was long and dark, streaming water, and her long velvet gown clung to her in soaking folds. "Salazar?" she said. Draco froze and stared. He knew her voice. He had heard it 100 times in his dreams. "Rowena," he said, knowing now who she was. "Rowena Ravenclaw." Her eyes filled with tears, and suddenly 2 other heads broke through the water and rose to join her. Both were as wet as she was, and both stared at him with mixed expressions. One was a dark-haired man who gazed at him in anger and loathing, while the woman beside him, small and round with red hair, looked sad. Godric, Draco thought, and Helga. Gryffindor stepped in front of Rowena as if to protect her, his eyes fixed on Draco. They were full of hate. "So, at last you are dead," he said. "We have waited 1,000 years for someone to give you the punishment you deserve and to end your worthless, stolen existence." Godric looked as if he meant to go on in this vein for quite some time, so Draco interrupted him. "I'm not who you think I am," he said. "I'm not Salazar Slytherin." Rowena, who had had her hand over her mouth, lowered it slowly. "Godric, he cannot be Salazar. He is only a child." Draco was indignant. "I'm 16, 17 in a few weeks." "I wouldn't put money on that," said Godric quite unkindly. Draco glared at him, deciding in that instant that he did not like Godric, but also knowing that in order to free himself from the tragic and destructive cycle of history repeating itself, it might be wise to try to like Godric. But he didn't want to like Godric. Godric, he thought, was a prat. He was glad that Godric didn't seem to be able to cross the river. He didn't know what it would feel like to be punched in the face in the afterlife, and didn't much care to find out. Rowena was still looking at Draco with a torrent of mixed emotions crossing her face. "You look just like him," she said. "You even sound just like him." "I'm his heir," said Draco, seeing no reason not to divulge this information. "Then you are cursed," said Gryffindor, "and fortunate to have died." "Godric," said Helga in a warning sort of tone. Godric looked from Rowena to Helga and did a little shuffle with his feet. "Well, he is cursed," he muttered, "if he is truly Salazar's heir." He turned to Draco. "How do you know you're the heir of Slytherin?" he demanded. "Because Slytherin said so," Draco snapped. "He said so?" breathed Rowena, her eyes widening, and Draco thought she looked like Hermione in that instant. It was very unnerving. You mean you've seen him? Yes, I've seen him, but he isn't as powerful as he claims to be. Of course, that could be because he lacks a source. Rowena's spirit began pacing in a tight circle. That won't last. Salazar is clever. He'll find himself a source. Has he tried to use you? She glanced up, shook her head. No, he wouldn't. Not his heir. He'll try to find someone else. She whirled and fixed Draco with an intense stare. He must be prevented from returning to his full power. I shudder to think of the destruction, the despair he could wreak. That is why we imprisoned him in the first place. He told Hermione he shut himself away from the world. He lied, said Rowena definitively. He didn't want you to think he was weak, did not want you to know how we defeated him. Helga and I could not kill him, but we rendered him powerless. If I tell you how he can be defeated, will you do it? Look, I'd love to defeat Slytherin for you, but there's a slight problem with that plan, said Draco resignedly. I appear to be dead. You are not dead until you have crossed this river, said Rowena fiercely. The green bank is the bank of the living, and the grey bank is the bank where the spirits of the murdered and unavenged dead roam. You are betwixt and between here, child. But you're dead, he pointed out. We cannot truly die until Salazar dies, said Rowena. The river itself is where the spirits of those neither truly alive nor truly dead reside. It is a terrible fate, one he has doomed us to. Did he murder you all? Asked Draco curiously. Not exactly, said Rowena. Well, he did murder Godric. Bastard, muttered Gryffindor. He snuck up behind me. Rowena shook her head. I suppose Salazar thought it was self-defense in some twisted way. We had all realized that we must take steps to protect ourselves against him. Together we forged a magical weapon, each part crafted by one of us. Salazar must have discovered our plans. He struck first at Godric, then he attacked us, Helga and me. But at the last, he hesitated. Rowena's voice shook slightly. Because of the sword, he could not be killed. So I did the next best thing. I imprisoned him in stasis, hid his body away in his castle, and drained his powers into an orb. Draco was bewildered. An orb? Rowena nodded. He needs to find the orb. Without it, he is merely propping up his powers. I could not destroy it, so I hid it away where it would be protected by the fiercest monster Salazar himself had ever created. But the drain on my magic powers was so great that it killed me. She paused for a moment to consider Draco before adding, to imprison him and strip him of his powers, you'll need the other 3 heirs and their keys. Draco opened his mouth to ask how the hell he was supposed to find these supposed keys, when Helga suddenly spoke, her dark eyes wide as she stepped slightly away from the others. There are spirits upon the bank who would speak to the boy, she said. Draco glanced behind her in surprise and saw that the riverbank seemed to surge upward, and on it appeared thousands upon thousands of twisted, translucent forms, which appeared before him and stretched as far as his eye could see and beyond. One of them caught his eye, and Draco had to fight back a gasp. She was kneeling on the riverbank, and, like the others, she was gray and shadowy, but something about her eyes held him. She held out her hand to catch at another who was kneeling beside her, and there was no mistaking who he was. He was a tall man with dark, untidy hair and glasses, and even if Draco hadn't seen the pictures that Sirius kept on his desk, he would have known who these two were. He was looking at Harry's parents. Hermione stumbled down the staircase, at first confused as to where she was. The last thing she remembered was being in Slytherin's castle, and now, well, everything here looked oddly similar, except that it wasn't as dreadfully cold. She paused on the landing of another staircase leading down, and that's when she noticed a familiar tapestry hanging on the wall opposite. I'm in Malfoy Manor, she reasoned at last, although her brain still felt like the consistency of oatmeal. If she was in Malfoy Manor, that meant both Harry and Draco had to be around here somewhere. She pressed on, ignoring the strange fact that her feet were bare, and she seemed to be dressed in something that reminded her of a burial shroud. Descending the steps, she nearly slipped on an object that lay on the floor and fell, slamming her knee into the ground. The pain was sharp and immediate, and she rolled over, clutching her arm. Stumbling to her feet, she looked down to see what she had slipped on. A wand. It looked like Sirius's. She reached down to retrieve it when she heard what sounded like Narcissa calling out for Sirius, and suddenly Draco's mother rounded the corner. She stopped dead when she saw Hermione crouched in the middle of the hall, bent over Sirius's wand. Hermione, she breathed, and nearly raced forward, her eyes alight with shock and worry. You're awake? Yes, Hermione replied, her voice sounding very hoarse, almost as if it had been some time since she used it. But that's impossible, Narcissa said, now reaching out a hand to help the kneeling girl to her feet. Hermione suspected she was trying to make sure that she was real. You were under a very powerful sleeping draught. There's no way you could have... She broke off as a sudden thought struck her. Draco. Hermione opened her mouth to reply when a blood-curdling howl split the air. It appeared to be coming from the open trap door which led down to the dungeons. The sound caused the two to clutch each other in momentary terror. Remus, said Narcissa suddenly, and began to make her way towards the drawing room, unknowingly dragging Hermione along with her. Forgetting the wand, Hermione followed, limping towards the sound of the howling. They descended the steps quickly and began to round every corner with frightening speed. Hermione nearly stumbling behind Narcissa as they came to the gate that blocked off the dungeons. The older woman wrenched it open and ran inside, calling for Sirius. I'm here, came a terse voice from a cell at the end of the corridor. Narcissa ran towards it, and Hermione followed, then came up short. Sirius was in a cell, backed against the opposite wall, and between him and the cell door was a wolf. A wolf the size of a small pony, gray and silver, its lips pulled back from its teeth, its ears lying flat back against its head. Not it, she reminded herself. It's Professor Lupin. You've seen him change before. But surely, when he had changed the last time, he hadn't been quite so large, or so ferocious looking. Sirius, Narcissa hissed through the bars, change into your animal form. You said he's only a danger to humans. Tried that, said Sirius shortly. Didn't work. Narcissa, don't tell me to get out of here, she snapped hotly. I'm not going to do it and leave you here to be eaten. He won't eat me, Sirius began, then broke off as the wolf emitted another blood-curdling snarl. Well, he amended, edging slightly farther away from the wolf. If he did, he'll be very sorry afterward.
Oh, he'll eat you all right, the demon interrupted. As soon as the cell becomes strong enough, I'll give you 5 minutes.
Narcissa ignored this. Sirius, there must be something. The Lycanthie, said Sirius quickly. That silver thing of Draco's. That used to be a portkey. I need that. Can you summon it for me? Narcissa already had her wand in her hand. Accio Lycanthie. There was a short silence. They waited, heart pounding, the snarl of the wolf in their ears, and a sudden mental picture of Harry came to Hermione. Standing on the field during the first task, hand outstretched for his firebolt, and waiting. Clink. The lycanthie flew towards Narcissa, ricocheting off the bars of the cell opposite, and she reached up to catch it. Her fingers closed around it, and a blackness so intense flashed behind her eyes. She staggered and fell. Her back hit the stone wall behind her, dropping the lycanthie as she did so. "Narcissa!" Sirius called out, worried. "I'm all right, Sirius," she said. In the mild confusion, Hermione stepped out from the shadows and picked up the lycanthie. Sirius gasped when he saw her, and Hermione saw him open his mouth, but the words were drowned out as darkness flooded Hermione's vision. And then, in quick succession, a series of images raced across the back of her eyelids. A castle surrounded by thorns, a great glass orb in which flames trembled, a table on which rested a cup, a dagger, and a scabbard, the polished surface of a mirror which reflected only darkness. Her vision cleared, and she was suddenly back in the dungeon, staring through the bars of the cage at Sirius and the werewolf, still locked in their frightful staring contest. Her knees felt weak, and there was a buzzing in her ears, but she knew what she had to do. She strode up to unlock the cell door, flung it open, and walked inside. Distantly, she could hear Sirius yelling her name and Narcissa telling her to stop, but she ignored it. She did not feel at all afraid, not even when the wolf turned from snarling at Sirius to face her, its eyes narrowing, muscles tensing. And then she raised her hand with the silver lycanthie in it and held it out in front of the werewolf, who cringed back and let out an unearthly, whimpering howl. Hermione took a deep breath and raised the lycanthie higher, directing the light of it at the werewolf as if it were a wand. "Tutamen mali intus," she cried, "cum monstrumum colequa repulsis. Repulsis!" The werewolf stiffened. Its eyelids drooped, its limbs trembled, and then it crashed to the ground in a heap and lay still. Hermione gasped, and the burning light in the back of her mind vanished, like a switch turning off. Shaking, she let her arm fall to her side and looked up at Sirius and Narcissa. Both were white as ghosts and staring at her. "What did you do?" asked Sirius. "And how?" put in Narcissa. "I don't know," she whispered, staring back at them, and then, recalling why she was there, reached out to seize Sirius's hand, which was icy cold. "Sirius, something's wrong. Draco." Heart pounding, Draco turned to face Harry's parents, feeling somehow that facing them directly was the least he could do. His eyes fastened on Harry's father, and Draco felt a chill go through him. James Potter raised black eyes to Draco's. "I'm sorry to interrupt your conversation," he said. "Oh," said Draco, that's all right. For a moment I thought you were Lucius Malfoy, but no, you must be his son?" asked James. Draco nodded. "I suppose I should tell you that your father and I are old enemies," James said with candor. "That's all right," said Draco. "My father and I are old enemies as well." The spirit of Lily Potter tugged at her husband's sleeve. James looked down at her, then back at Draco, and he braced himself, knowing what James was about to say. "If you're Lucius's son, you must go to Hogwarts. Do you know our son? His name is Harry," Draco finished. "Harry Potter." Lily pushed forward. She was standing in front of James now. "So you do know him?" she asked, her voice light, wavering, and very pretty. "Yes, Everyone knows Harry Potter," Draco said lamely. "He's famous." "How old is he now?" James pressed. Draco couldn't look at him. 16. Please, Lily interrupted. Could you tell us about him? Just a little bit. What is he like? Is he happy? Draco looked at her and saw how the eyes that were so like Harry's looked at him, entreating, begging him for something. What are you doing? Said a little voice in the back of his head. Tell them something. Tell them you know him well, that he's nearly your brother. He looked at Lily and then at James, looking eerily like Harry, and both the spirits were looking at him with hopeful expectation. Then he looked down at the transparent rushing river, wishing he could just disappear into it. Why can't I be Ron or Sirius? Draco thought. Someone he cares about. And the last person he would want talking to his parents. The last person. Harry is... He looked away, but pressed on lamely. A fantastic Quidditch player for Gryffindor. He was their youngest seeker in 100 years. He'll be team captain next year and... You're fading, James said suddenly. Draco looked down and nearly yelled in horror. His body had become eerily transparent. Someone is calling you back. Frantic, Draco looked back at the two spirits. I'm sorry I didn't get to tell you more, he said. No, at least we know something. There is no time in this place. An hour could be a minute, a moment a year. It's good to know at least something about our son, James said, then added, Don't tell Harry that you saw us. It would just cause him pain. However, can you take a message back with you? There is a man called Sirius Black. He's Harry's godfather. You might have seen him picking up Harry at platform 9 3/4 at the end of term. Find him. Tell him to go into his vault at Gringotts and take from it what I gave to him just before I died. Give it to Harry. He's the heir of Gryffindor, you know, and he'll be needing it soon. Tell Sirius that The ground jerked under Draco's feet, and a soft implosion sent the world flying at his face like hurtling glass. He would have thrown his arms up to protect himself, but a tearing pain ripped through his chest, doubling him over, and he began to cough in great, wrenching gasps, which spit water all over the dark grass of the Weasleys' back garden. His eyes blinked open. He was lying on his back under a black sky, and Harry was hunched down by his shoulder. Ron beside him, with the back of his wrist pressed against his mouth, as if he were trying to keep himself from yelling or being sick. On his other side was Ginny, who looked a degree worse than her brother, not just pale, but crying as well. Draco took a breath and could hear his chest gurgling like a leaky radiator. It was painful, but otherwise... "You're alive," said Harry, looking and sounding amazed. He turned to his best friend. "Ron, you did it!" "Oof," said Ron, still goggling at Draco, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Draco wanted to ask what was going on, but discovered that taking in air made his chest hurt even more. He concentrated on breathing shallowly and flicked his eyes towards Harry. "Hey, Potter." Harry leaned forward so quickly that one of his insubstantial hands went through Draco's chest. Draco glared at him. Harry looked contrite. "Sorry. Never mind. What happened? You drowned. Ron revived you. How?" Harry grinned. "Mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, Malfoy." "What?" Draco's eyes flicked over to Ron, widening. "Oh, how disgusting," he said out loud, before he could help it. This sent him off into another spasm of coughing, and when he recovered, saw Ron glaring at him. "Well, it's no picnic for me either, you ungrateful git," he said. "At least you were dead for most of the experience. Now I just wish I was." Draco coughed again, feeling as if he were coughing up his own lungs. He put a hand to his chest and sat up, which seemed to ease the pressure under his rib cage. Ginny scooted up next to him and put a hand to his forehead. "You're still freezing," she said, and began to undo his dragon hide jacket. "What are you doing?" Draco asked, and reached to try and pull her hands away, but his fingers wouldn't obey him. "You're soaking wet, and could catch cold if we don't get these clothes off," said Ginny, then turned to her brother. "Ron, give me your pajama top." Ron glared at her. "Fine," she snapped. "I'll give him my pajama top." "I'll take option number 2, said Draco through chattering teeth. Ron sighed, took his top off, and tossed it to Ginny, who proceeded to use it to dry Draco's hair. As she did so, another coughing spasm doubled Draco over, and when he straightened up, it took him several moments to focus his eyes. "Bugger," he said, and his voice sounded like a bubbling lake. He was vaguely aware of the Ginny blob looking at him with alarm, and then there was a soft pop as someone apparated into the garden. "Sirius!" Draco heard Ron mutter under his breath, sounding relieved. "Thank Merlin." There was a thump, and Sirius dropped down on his knees next to Draco, who had begun shivering again, and with every shiver his vision blackened farther. "I won't faint," he thought crossly. "I won't." He felt Sirius's fingers on his neck, checking his pulse, then a hand against his forehead. It reminded him of his mother when she would check him for fever. "Hypothermic shock," he heard Sirius say calmly. "He'll be fine if we get him inside. I'm going to lift you up now. Brace yourself, all right?" Draco nodded and felt Sirius's hand slide under his back, the other under his knees, picking him up. He did not remember ever having been carried like that before, not by his own father anyway, and was surprised to find he didn't mind it too much. He threw an arm around Sirius's neck and saw Ginny's white and worried face. Then all the shapes of the world ran together like watercolor, and Draco did something he had always sworn he would never do. He fainted. Sirius shifted Draco's limp weight a little more comfortably before looking at Harry. "I'm sending you back," he said softly. "All right," Harry replied, the adrenaline beginning to drain away from him. Sirius hesitated a moment before doing anything, then said, "Just so you're not shocked when you get back, there is something you need to know." Harry, Ron, and Ginny all looked at him expectantly, even though Sirius was clearly only speaking to Harry. "Hermione's awake," he said clearly. Ron gasped, and so would have Harry, if Sirius, holding his wand loosely in his hand that was tucked under Draco's knees, hadn't propelled him back with a well-coordinated counterspell. Wham! Harry opened his eyes, feeling somewhat as if he had been struck head-on by the Hogwarts Express and thrown about 50 feet into a patch of nettles. He blinked, focusing his eyes, and saw that he was back in the armchair in the Malfoy family library, staring up at the ceiling with its design of constellations picked out in gold leaf. It took him several tries, but he managed to sit up and flex his fingers. His whole body stung with pins and needles, and he suddenly became aware of someone watching him, and turned to see Hermione kneeling by the arm of his chair. She was dressed normally now, and staring at him with huge eyes. "Hermione!" he nearly shouted, the shock of seeing her awake again making his heart pound so fast he thought he was about to have a heart attack on top of the body aches. "You're all right," she said, and looked both as if she were about to cry and worried all at the same time. He nodded, feeling strange and numb. Then she was up and off the floor and in his lap in less than a second, her arms wrapped around his neck. He buried his face against her, where her neck curved down into her shoulder. Her hair smiled like it always did, like Moroccan mint tea. He felt her chest hitch, and then she was crying against him, dryly, and with a soundless sort of despair. And he clung to her. Just knowing that she was real was enough to clear away some of the fog that had taken up residence in his brain the last few days. "I never should have sent you through," said a voice behind them, and both Harry and Hermione pulled away from each other to see Narcissa standing in the room beside them. "Mrs. Malfoy," Harry began, not knowing what to say in this moment, but wanting to say something. "Draco, he's dead, isn't he?" Harry looked at her, profoundly startled. "How did you—" "Hermione's awake," she said simply. "That must mean the love spell's off her. Only something as powerful as death might have the power to wake someone who is under the effects of a sleeping draught. Or at least, I think so." Hermione scrubbed the back of her hand across her eyes. "I don't remember anything, just that I felt as if I were living out some horrible waking nightmare. But even if I were coherent, I never would have wanted—" "Hermione," said Harry kindly, "no one blames you for what happened, okay? And I have to tell both of you something, and I'm not sure either of you are going to believe it." And half an hour later, Harry had divulged all, and when he was finished, Hermione sat there staring at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. After a moment of startled silence, she finally managed to say, "Ron, you mean to tell me that Ron saved his life? You're kidding! I can't believe it! I bet Ron can't either. He must be going spare." Harry grinned, but suddenly Hermione's expression changed, and she leapt off his lap in a gesture of unexpected haste. "Where's the Floo powder?" she demanded abruptly. Harry was at a loss. "What?" he asked, confused by this sudden change in topic. "We have to get to the Burrow, don't we? We have to make sure that Draco's all right. Oh, I wish I could apparate. Where's the bloody Floo powder?" she asked again. "Hermione, do stop rushing about," Narcissa said. "Anyway, the Floo powder is downstairs in the kitchen." "Let's go get it then," Hermione demanded. "Don't be silly," Narcissa said. "If you can manage to sit still for a few minutes, I'll go and get it." Enervate. Draco came back to consciousness instantly, his eyes flying open, fixing on Sirius's face. "Where am I?" "In Percy Weasley's bedroom. Sorry to wake you up, but I want you to drink this." And he held up a mug full of some steaming liquid. Draco hesitated. "Do you need me to help you sit up?" Sirius asked. He nodded. Sirius reached out and helped him into a sitting position, feeling more than a little concerned at the coldness of Draco's skin. He'd dried the boy's clothes with a Disacaris charm and covered him with every spare blanket he could find, but it didn't seem to have raised his icy temperature much. Draco took the mug from Sirius with the sleepy-eyed and unquestioning acceptance of the completely exhausted. He drank it down and felt the heat of what he now knew was a warming potion course feebly through his insides. Sirius took the mug back and placed it on the bedside table, while Draco leaned back against the pillows, pressing the heels of his hands to his temples. Sirius had a sudden urge to reach over and pat Draco on the shoulder, but didn't. "Where's everyone else?" Draco asked, his eyelids drooping with tiredness. "Harry I sent back to the manor, but the rest are all downstairs. But you won't be seeing any of them until tomorrow. I'll be fetching your mother in a little while." Draco pushed a little fretfully at the enormous heap of blankets covering him. "I was dead, Sirius," he said. "I saw the Founders. I talked to them, and—" "Draco," Sirius said, and took him firmly by the shoulders. "You need to go to sleep. Your body needs the rest. Tell me all about whatever you saw tomorrow. All right?" Draco's eyes narrowed. "You don't believe me." Sirius sighed and let him go. "Honestly, no. Your body was breaking down. Who knows what your mind thought it saw? But if it'll make you happy, you can tell me all about it. Tomorrow." Draco's eyes had fallen shut. "I thought everyone was curious about what happens after you die," he said, his words slurred with tiredness. Well, yes, but unlike you, we do not go on reconnaissance missions to find out. And that's all I'm going to say about it. Go to sleep, Draco. Sirius got up and grabbed the mug from off the table. He was halfway across the room when Draco spoke again. I saw Harry's parents, too. The mug nearly slipped from Sirius's hand, and he spun around, aware that his heart was pounding unevenly in his chest. What do you mean you saw them? What I said, replied Draco in a half-sleepy voice. I was in a place full of ghosts. There were thousands of them, and Harry's parents were there. James thought I was my father at first, and came over to me. What did he say? Whispered Sirius, hearing the hopeful anguish in his own voice, and winced at it. Never mind, he said harshly. You were half dead, Draco. You were hallucinating. Why would I hallucinate Harry's parents? Draco asked reasonably. Sirius pressed the tips of his fingers to his eyes. I don't know. It was then. Harry's father said there was something in your vault at Gringotts for Harry. Something he gave you just before he died. James didn't give me anything just before he died, said Sirius flatly. Go to sleep, Draco. He heard a defeated sigh from the boy in the bed, and then a muffled, good night, Sirius. Sirius went out of the room and shut the door behind him and fell back against it, his hands over his eyes. Why exactly he had lied to Draco about having been given something by James, he wasn't sure. One thing he was sure of, though, he would be going to Gringotts tomorrow. Ron and Ginny sat in the warm, yellow-lit kitchen drinking tea and eating biscuits that had been recently cooked by Mrs. Weasley. With all the commotion going on in the house, the two Weasley parents had been roused rather abruptly. Naturally, Mrs. Weasley demanded to know what was going on, and when she was informed of Draco's untimely death and resurrection, she had become so distraught that she began busying herself in the kitchen. Mr. Weasley, on the other hand, had asked if Sirius needed any help, and was informed that he didn't think it was necessary. Confident that the other man would be able to keep the house in order, he gave Mrs. Weasley a quick kiss before telling her he would see her later at the ministry. By that time, Harry and Hermione arrived via Floo powder. Narcissa had stayed behind, trusting beyond a shadow of a doubt that Sirius would be enough of a parental figure to handle things. There had been quite a scene when they had shown up. Ron looked so surprised at Hermione's miraculous recovery that he nearly fell over, and Ginny couldn't help but to give a little gasp of surprise. When they were all settled in with hot drinks and food, Mrs. Weasley finished cleaning up the kitchen, quickly kissed both of her children goodbye, and apparated to the ministry. When she was gone, Hermione took the opportunity to ask, "Is he all right?" Ron nodded, but he didn't look exactly happy about it. "He's fine." "Considering that you dithered a bit on saving him at first, yeah," Harry pointed out. "Did not," Ron protested, then amended. "Well, a little. He just looked so dead. It seemed pointless." "He was dead," said Ginny, nibbling at a biscuit. "Clinically, anyway. No pulse, no heartbeat, no brainwaves." "Does Malfoy even have brainwaves?" put in Ron, but no one was listening. "It's interesting," she added, "that Draco being clinically dead was enough to counteract the love potion." "It makes sense, though," said Hermione, who was holding onto her teacup like it was a lifeline. "In a way, it's how old magic works." A sort of uncomfortable silence was beginning to descend, when a voice from the doorway caused them all to turn. "A bit early for you lot to be up, isn't it?" Ginny looked up first. "Charlie!" she exclaimed. The rest of them looked up as well. It was certainly Charlie Weasley, tousle-haired and tired-eyed. He was wearing his dragon-keeping clothes, and there was a dusty satchel slung across his back. "Hello, all," he said. "How'd you get here, Charlie?" Ron asked. "Dragon?" Charlie rolled his eyes. told you before, Ron, people don't ride dragons. That's just a cutesy myth. I apparated, of course.
Did you come because of Draco? Ginny asked Charlie, looking curious.
He looked blank. Because of Draco? There was a step on the stairs, and Sirius came into the kitchen, looking disheveled and immeasurably tired. His eyes lit up when he saw Charlie, however. "Charlie," he said eagerly, crossing the room to shake the other man's hand. "Did you get my owl, then? Wonderful. I really need to get back to the matter," and Charlie shook his head. "I didn't get any owl from you. I came because my mum wrote and told me about Dad being elected minister, and that they will be staying in London for a few days. So she asked me—" He glanced around again, as if seeing Harry and Hermione for the first time. "What are you lot doing here, anyway?" There was a short silence. Harry looked at Ron. Ron looked at Ginny. Ginny looked at Sirius. Sirius looked at Charlie and sighed. "Come into the living room for a second," he said. "I'll fill you in on the details." "All right," said Charlie slowly, hefting his satchel onto his back. Sirius turned to the rest of them. "I want one of you to sit with Draco, just in case anything happens."
"I will," said Ginny, taking the lead.
"Thanks," said Sirius, then turned back to Charlie. "Let's go." As Charlie followed Sirius out of the room, Hermione heard him say, "I brought a bottle of Ogin's Old Fire whiskey with me." Sirius clapped him on the back. "Bless you, Charlie Weasley." "Here's that book I was telling you about," said Ron, coming into the living room where Hermione was sitting on the overstuffed sofa, her hands wrapped around another mug of tea. She put the mug down and took the proffered book, a musty, leather-bound tome with gold stamping on the spine. Lives of the Hogwarts Founders. "Thanks, Ron." He sat down in the armchair next to her and glanced at Harry, who was lying on his back with his head in Hermione's lap, an arm thrown over his face. "Are you asleep?" he asked. Said Harry without moving. "That means no," said Hermione, opening the book and beginning to scan the pages. "I think." "What exactly are you looking for?" Ron asked curiously.
"I'm not sure exactly. Information about the lives of the founders."
"I guess that makes sense, since Harry said there wasn't anything of note in Slytherin's diary." Since her awakening, the others had done their best to fill Hermione in on all that had transpired. This included the infamous diary translation.
"True," she said, "ranting on and on about destiny and fate, and rather a lot about lizards, isn't what I would call historical fact. But what I do think is interesting about Slytherin are the parallels to He Who Must Not Be Named. I mean, the Dark Mark, the whole process by which he achieved immortality. I don't know what it means, but
It means that evil is evil, Hermione," Ron said a bit bitterly, "whatever time period you're in." Hermione cocked her head to the side, but couldn't read his expression.
You all right?"
Before Ron could reply, the living room door opened, and Sirius and Narcissa entered. With no warning whatsoever, she swooped down on Ron and kissed him. Ron turned scarlet.
"Harry told me what you did for Draco," she said to him.
Said Ron, sinking down in his seat. "It was nothing."
"It was not nothing. It was everything. You're an amazing boy, Ronald Weasley, and I'm very grateful to you."
Ron, still busy exploring all the different shades of red it was possible to turn, appeared to have nothing to say to this. Sirius looked as if he might have smiled, if he hadn't been so tired. "Come along, love," he said. "Draco's upstairs with Charlie and Ginny." Releasing Ron with a last look of gratitude, Narcissa followed Sirius upstairs. Hermione grinned at Ron.
"You've been getting kissed a lot this evening, haven't you?"
Ron narrowed his eyes at her. "That CPR business," he said morosely. "You'd think that the Muggles would have found some other way to revive the mostly dead. Some way that didn't involve kissing."
same. Well, you did save his life, Ron, said Hermione. Ron blinked, his color working on returning to normal. Well, anyway, I may not like Malfoy, but his mum's all right. Not wanting to disturb Harry, Hermione tried not to giggle. Maybe she can convince the Ministry to give you a medal. Oh, or your very own chocolate frog card. Bah, said Ron, but he looked thoughtful. He got up out of his chair, leaned over, and kissed Hermione on the temple. I'm going to bed. See you in the morning. See you. Said Harry again, feebly waving a few fingers in Ron's direction. That means good night, Hermione said, as Ron waved from the doorway, and he was gone, shutting the door behind him. Absently stroking Harry's hair, Hermione returned to her book. Hey, Harry, do you want me to read out loud to you? Okay. All right, then. Folk legend holds the lycanthropy was invented by none other than Rowena Ravenclaw herself, she read, to deal with the plague of werewolves that were overrunning the British Isles at the time, and was usually made of silver, a metal abhorred by the lycanthropic. It can be easily enchanted to create a portkey, purify water, and... She trailed off. Harry? She probed gently. He didn't respond. Hermione bit her lip. Perhaps she should wake him up and send him off to sleep in Ron's room while she went off to Ginny's. But she had been asleep long enough. Carefully, so as not to wake him, she laid the book down on the table next to the couch and leaned forward, putting her arms around him, and let her hair fall down like a curtain around them, hiding the rest of the world from view. Draco awoke, keeping his eyes shut fast, reeling from the shock of having slept and not having dreamed. He turned over, opened his eyes, and saw a blur of color that resolved itself slowly into the bright yellow of Percy's bedroom wallpaper. A square of blue sky outside the window told him that it was mid-morning, and in the red armchair next to the bed, a blur of black, white, and green wavered once and turned into Harry. He was sitting in the chair, looking wide-eyed and horribly cheerful, and across his lap, gleaming brightly in the sunlight, streaming through the window, was Slytherin's sword. Draco sat up so fast his head spun. Potter, what do you think you're doing? Harry looked at him oddly. I'm sitting in a chair. Is there something unusual about that? Draco narrowed his eyes at him. What I meant was, are you really here? As in, actually here, and not just a projection of yourself? In response, Harry kicked the side of the bed. Yep. Is this a wise decision? I would have thought that, given the events of yesterday, that Sirius would keep you as far away from me as possible. I didn't tell anyone about yesterday. You didn't tell... Why not? 2 things, said Harry, leaning over and propping the sword against the wall, where it gleamed incongruously against Percy's yellow wallpaper. 1, the state you're in, you couldn't attack me with a piece of spaghetti, because it would be too heavy for you. 2, you didn't dream about anything last night, did you? No, said Draco, looking warily at Harry. So maybe the love potion wasn't the only spell broken by your death. Potter, said Draco dubiously, that's a pretty shaky hypothesis. Well, let me ask you something then. What? Do you feel like killing me right now? Well, no, actually. Harry shrugged. There you go, he said, and reached over to pick a glass of water up off the bedside table and shoved it in Draco's direction. Here, drink this and quit bellyaching. Draco sat up to take the water and glanced down at himself. He appeared to be clad in a pair of maroon pajamas. Weasley hand-me-downs, he thought glumly. Maroon was a color that looked only slightly less noxious on him than pink. Who put me
in these pajamas?" he asked with deep suspicion.
"Ron did. He's become very attached to you. It's really kind of cute."
Draco sprayed water all over the bed. "What?" "Just kidding," said Harry brightly. "Ron still hates you with a fiery passion. Your mom put those pajamas on you, and she sat with you the rest of the night and all morning, but she had to go back to the ministry this afternoon." "How long have I been asleep?" Draco asked, completely ignoring the portion about his mother. "If by asleep you mean passed out, then around 10 hours or so," replied Harry. "We've been taking turns watching you." Draco gave Harry a very dark look at that. "You're disgustingly cheerful this morning, Potter. What's gotten into you?" Harry leaned back in his chair and grinned at Draco, and Draco thought he hadn't seen Harry look nearly this cheerful in weeks. It was slightly unbalancing. He had become used to a Harry with either a permanent scowl or a permanent worried look. "Well, Malfoy, it's about that love potion." Draco felt himself flush slightly. He reached over and put the glass down on the bedside table with a thump. "Oh, yes?" "Did you know it was irreversible except by death?" "No. So?" "Well, you died." Draco blinked in amazement. "So I did," he said, trying to get his mind around how he felt about this new development. "So, what does that mean for Hermione?" he asked finally. "Well, she's awake again," said Harry, with only a trace of hesitation. This revelation was enough to propel both boys into silence, as they privately ruminated on what the ramifications of the love spell might mean. Not only for themselves, but for Hermione as well. Harry decided to break the silence first, and reached behind him and lifted a brown paper parcel off the bedside table. "I almost forgot. You got an owl." "Really? From who?" "From Snape," said Harry, handing over the package as if it were a bomb about to go off. "Malfoy, why is Snape sending you care packages?" "It's a long story," Draco said absently, as he tore at the twine that held the package closed, but his fingers still wouldn't quite do what he wanted. "Here." Draco glanced up as Harry took something out of his pocket and tossed it to him. He caught it reflexively. It was Sirius's penknife, the one that had made the scar on Draco's hand and the matching one on Harry's. "Thanks." He flicked open the blade and sliced the package open. A flask full of opaque-colored liquid and a folded note fell out onto his lap. He shoved the note in the breast pocket of his pajamas, twisted the lid off the flask, and drank the fluid down, grimacing only slightly at the now familiar taste of the will-strengthening potion. Harry was looking at him as if he expected beetles to suddenly sprout out of his ears. "I can't believe you just drank that. Do you even know what it was?" Draco dropped the penknife on the bedside table and shrugged. "The difference between us, Potter, well, one of the many differences between us, is that Snape likes me. He would not send me poison." "So, you stayed with Snape. Is that where you ran off to, after you ghosted us?" "Yes, he let me stay with him," said Draco defensively. "Sort of. I kind of left without telling him where I was going. And as for ghosting you, I still think I did the right thing." "The right thing? Malfoy, you died. I thought that we were in this together." Draco blinked. "We can't be in anything together," he pointed out, slightly less disagreeably. "First time I saw you yesterday, I stabbed you. I think that about rules out some kind of budding relationship." "Look, Malfoy, my point was not that you should have hung around long enough to give in to your homicidal urges," said Harry keenly. "My point was that you should have let us in on your little plan. Do you think Sirius would have prevented you from asking Snape for help? He'd have written to him for you, pulled all his ministry strings. Lupin could have given you will-powering charms, or they could have wound up chaining me in the dungeon with the torture instruments."
You just don't know who to trust, do you? I don't trust myself, said Draco shortly. Well, I trust you, said Harry stubbornly. And that's a stupid thing to do, said Draco flatly. I'm not the one who does stupid things. That's your department. Draco crossed his arms and glared at Harry. I do not do stupid things. Oh, really? Let's take stock of all the stupid things you supposedly don't do. First, you insist on keeping an object you know perfectly well as a talisman of purest evil. Then you don't tell anyone that the sword is giving you nightmares, or that it's telling you to kill people. Then you tell off Lupin when he's trying to help you, snap it's serious, and go stomping off with your demon sword and try to feed yourself to a large group of dragons. What were you planning on doing for an encore? Standing on a hilltop during a lightning storm wearing a wetsuit of armor and yelling, "All the gods are bastards," at the top of your lungs? Draco burst out laughing, and the angry tension between them, which had been spiraling upwards rapidly, broke. Harry smiled grudgingly. That was actually pretty funny, Potter. And here I always thought your sense of humour amounted to a tepid bowl of tapioca. So admit you can be wrong. Draco looked at Harry. Harry looked back with unwavering green eyes. Okay, said Draco. Sometimes I'm wrong. About as often as the sky turns green and the earth starts revolving backwards, but, you know. I'll take that as a full admission of guilt, apology included. Now it's your turn to do something for me. Oh yeah? What? Tell me something about Snape, said Harry rather unexpectedly. Something bad, so that when he's glaring at me in potions with his greasy little eyes, I can think to myself, right, mate, go ahead and glare, but I know that you're actually a pool shark down at the Three Broomsticks where you make everyone call you Jimbo. Draco chuckled appreciatively. Keep it up, Potter. You're actually starting to sound like me, which is a vast improvement on your usual personality. Harry grimaced. Not at all. Come on, Malfoy. You're in his house. You must know something. Does he keep pictures of Professor McGonagall under his pillow? Does he serenade clippings of the Whomping Willow? Well, Draco allowed, I did hear him singing in the washroom. He actually sounded pretty good. Harry frowned. Snape being good at singing? That's not really what I had in mind. I'm not sure I can do better. Make something up, Harry suggested. Draco looked at him darkly. Oh, right, you don't lie. Have you always been like this, or is it part of the whole new and improved Draco Malfoy thing? Draco yawned and reached out for an extra pillow. Don't worry, Potter, he said, putting it behind his head. I may not lie, but I'm still a big fan of all the other sins. Wrath, sex, loud music. You can handle the lying part from here on out. Why do you get all the fun sins? Because I'm a fun kind of guy? If you think... Harry broke off at a knock on the door. That must be Hermione, he announced with the ghost of a smile. She said she wanted to be the one to watch you next, even if you weren't awake. Draco looked at him curiously. How do you know it's her? Harry shrugged slightly. You know her knock? Harry's ears turned pink, and he glared at Draco defiantly. But before either of them could say anything else, the door opened and Hermione came in. She looked at Harry and then over at Draco and smiled hesitantly. So, you're awake? How do you feel? Draco gave her an equally quiet smile. I feel fine. Well, that's good, she said, and came a little farther into the room. Harry stood up and crossed the room where he kissed Hermione. Not just a casual kiss either, but a deep, passionate kiss that spoke volumes as to how the last few weeks without her had affected him. Draco looked away, feeling guilty and embarrassed. Harry smiled when he pulled away from her. Have a nice time, you two. See you later, he added, waving at Draco, who gave a half-hearted wave back. The moment Harry left the room, shutting the door behind him, an awkward silence descended on Draco and Hermione. She was looking at the floor, he out the window.
Finally, Draco said, "Hello." Hermione cleared her throat. "Hello to you too," she replied, and hesitated. "You can come near me, you know," he said. "I drowned. It's not contagious." She tried to smile at him. "I didn't know if you would want me to," she said, and walked over to sit down in the chair recently vacated by Harry. Draco shook his head. "You weren't to blame for what happened. That was Slytherin and Pettigrew's fault." Absently, Hermione reached up and touched the silver lycanthropy which was strung on a chain around her neck. Somehow, she had found that doing this gave her strength. "It felt like I was in some kind of waking nightmare. I was unfair to you, and to Harry." "Hermione, it's all right. You weren't you in those moments," replied Draco shortly. "Anyway, it's over now, but there's something tying us together. Like I'm tied to the sword, like my father was tied to that dark mark branded into his skin." Hermione felt a flutter of uneasiness at his tone. "I do care about you," she said, in a voice that wobbled. "I told you that before. Maybe not the same way I care about Harry, but I do. Do you know what happened to me when I thought you died? Do you know how I felt?" "Hermione," he said, then threw the covers back now and slid to the edge of the bed, facing her. He reached out at the same time she did. Their hands met, and she gripped his tightly, trying not to wince at their coldness. "Do you remember what Slytherin said when he saw you with me?" Draco asked. She shook her head. "I told you, I don't remember much of anything." "Well, he was pleased, because he sensed that this tie, this bond, whatever we have, was working." "What's wrong with having a bond? That doesn't necessarily have to be something evil." Draco hesitated. "When I was under the influence of the sword, I was having nightmares, I know. Yes, nightmares. About you. Well, about other things as well, but you were always in them. I think they were being sent to me from somewhere else, but still, it was every night, Hermione. Every night. And I'm still afraid." She was staring at him. "What am I doing?" "What?" "In the dreams. What am I doing?" Draco looked at her with obvious reluctance. "Sometimes we're married, or at least we live together, and it's all very ordinary and pleasant. Once we were hunting in the woods together. 2 nights ago I dreamed that I was ill and that you came to see me. And you said that you let a snake bite you on purpose," said Hermione slowly, her voice falling into a dreamlike cadence. Draco had gone very white. There was a moment of total silence. Draco stared at her with the expression of someone watching the night sky for a glimpse of falling stars. Bemused, distracted, hopeful. Finally, he said, "How did you know?" She reached out and took his other hand, covering it with both of hers, hoping it would make him a little less cold. "When I was under the effects of the sleeping potion, most of the time it was like I was walking through thick fog that I couldn't escape. But other times, I would dream," she said. "It was so real." She leaned forward, looking at him intently. The blood was beginning to flood back into his face. There were patches of hectic color on his cheekbones, making him look feverish. "Draco, you have to tell me everything that's been going on with you. I can help you solve this. I promise you I can. I swear. Do you believe me?" He hesitated. "Yes." Whoever called it memory lave was a cretin, Sirius thought, looking around him. Lane conjured up the image of a pretty country road lined with flowers, blue sky, and birds chirping. As far as he was concerned, however, Memory Lane was a black road lined with cruel thorns, paved with jagged rocks, bordered with the gravestones of his friends. Sirius turned around slowly and shivered. It was cold in Gringotts Vault 711, and his exhaled breath came out in a cloud of frost. It had been years since he'd been down here. Usually his withdrawals and deposits were handled by Owlpost, so there was no need for a personal visit, as he had no wish to see the detritus of his former life. In one corner was his motorcycle, gleaming and perfect thanks to the anti-rust charms. Chests that held his old clothes, schoolbooks, photo albums, and his aura certificate were crammed into one corner. There was plenty of gold, the penalty money the ministry had been forced to pay him when the original ruling that had sent him to Azkaban had been overturned. 1,000 galleons for each year he had spent in prison. It was quite a lot of money, but Sirius had touched very little of it. He walked over to another corner of the vault and knelt down among the various books and papers. It took him a few minutes of shuffling through them to find what he was looking for. A book, very fat, bound in leather, and stamped with silver on the spine. Dialectical Interpretations of the Art and Science of Anthromancy by K. Fraser. Sirius closed his eyes and heard James's voice, sharp and amused, telling him that it was the most boring-sounding title he could think up. He opened his eyes, sighed, and pressed down hard with his thumb on the F in Fraser. Pop! The book's cover ratcheted back, exposing a hollowed-out space inside where once the Marauder's map had been hidden before its confiscation. Now it held something else. Sirius's eyes widened. "James," he whispered, his breath escaping from his mouth in little white puffs. "What on earth do you expect him to do with this?" "Hey, Ron, have you seen Harry?" Ron, who'd been looking restlessly out the window, glanced over at his sister, who had just come into the living room carrying a pair of boots. He shrugged. "I think he's denoming the garden with Charlie. Why?" Ginny flopped down on the floor and began lacing her boots up. "I wanted to ask him if I could borrow his pocket knife, but never mind. Where's Hermione?" Ron pointed towards the staircase, indicating the upstairs floor. "Talking to Malfoy, or whatever," he said succinctly. Ginny looked up at her brother, at his sour expression. "Does that bother you?" "Does it bother you?" Ron returned, apparently not interested in answering the question himself. Ginny thought about it for a moment, then gave a half-hearted shrug. "She can do what she likes, and I don't exactly have a say in who Draco chooses to spend his time with." "Well, if I were in Harry's shoes, I wouldn't let them be alone together at all," Ron continued bitterly, "not after what Malfoy pulled." "Can't not let people do things, Ron. You just have to trust them," Ginny reasoned, although she could understand why her brother was feeling this way. The last time Draco and Hermione were alone together, she had been struck down by a love potion. Ron looked as if he thought this was an extremely suspect line of reasoning, but looked eager to change the subject and pointed to her shoes. "What's with the boots, anyway?" "I'm going down into the cellar to investigate." Ron looked baffled. "Investigate what?" Ginny shrugged. "What Dad's always going on about. Our Hufflepuff ancestry. I mean, Hermione did say that Helga Hufflepuff looked just like me in that tapestry she saw, so it makes sense that if there was anything tying us to Hufflepuff, it's in the cellar. There's just miles of tunnels and things down there that no one's ever bothered to look into for hundreds of years. Remember when George found that spear thing and Dad said it dated back to one of the first Goblin rebellions?" Ron shook his head. "Seems a bit far-fetched, but suit yourself." "Why don't you come with me?
We're not needed up here at the moment. Spiders, hedged Ron, then said, Besides, I think it's my turn to set with Malfoy again. Ginny nodded. You're right, I'd forgotten the time. I'll see you later then, she said, and yanked the cellar door open before descending the stairs. I can't believe you're taking notes on what I'm telling you. Hermione glanced up at Draco and gave a weak smile. Well, you never know what will turn out to be important, do you? I can't believe you talked to the founders in person. You're like history on legs now. Draco looked mournful. I'd rather be sex appeal on legs. History is a very sexy subject. Which is why Professor Binns is just hell on wheels with the ladies down at the Three Broomsticks. Professor Binns is dead, Draco. So was I. Hermione made a face at him, then bit the end of her quill as she regarded Draco thoughtfully. Now, you're sure that what Rowena said to you was that you need the heirs, the keys, and that orb? Yes. Does that mean something to you? The keys don't, but when I was down in the dungeons at Malfoy Manor, I saw a flash of an orb when I used the lycanthropy on Professor Lupin, she replied, and leaned forward in her chair, staring at her notebook on her knees. Perhaps the lycanthropy is one of these so-called keys. I need to finish that book about the founders, and I'll get Sirius to bring me Slytherin's diary. Somewhere there's an explanation. As Hermione scanned her notes, Draco suddenly felt unutterably tired. He yawned, sliding down under the covers. Are you meant to stay with me while I'm sleeping as well? I will if you like, although I think it's about time for Ron's turn. Weasley? Doesn't saving my life exempt him from sickbed duty? Technically, yes, but Harry thought it would be a good idea for the two of you to talk. Draco groaned and pulled the covers over his head. This is a setup. Maybe, said Hermione severely, but if we're all going to work together, then it's best if we all get along. Maybe Weasley and I are perfectly happy hating each other. Hermione looked up at him. Ron is not a hateful person. You were out for a long time, Hermione, said Draco from under the coverlet. So you missed the screaming match we had at each other's expense the last time we tried to talk. Hermione furrowed her brow and would have made some sort of remark, but at that moment the door opened and Ron came into the room. He glanced from Draco to Hermione with a somewhat suspicious expression. Draco knew he couldn't let the silence linger too long, and knew that neither Hermione nor Ginny would ever forgive him if he didn't say something about Ron saving his life. He took a deep breath and said, Come here, Weasley. Ron inched reluctantly across the room until he stood about a foot from the end of Draco's bed. I know that I haven't always been the easiest guy to get along with, said Draco, looking as if every word was being dragged out of him with a fishhook. But given what you've done for me, and everything we've been through lately, I just wanted to say that I've come to regard you as someone that I've met. Ron looked at him. That's the speech I get for saving your life. Draco had the grace to look embarrassed. I can't help it. In the olden days, my ancestors would just cut off a limb and mail it off to whoever they'd offended, or commit ritual suicide. That sounds promising. You are both idiots! Hermione thundered and stood up, glaring at the boys with deep displeasure, before firmly snatching up her notebook and stalking out of the room. Ron glared at Draco. So, it's the boy who died. Draco looked bored. I was wondering how long it was going to be before somebody made that lame joke. Ron shook his head. You really are an unbelievable git. What? Just because you saved my life, I have to laugh at your jokes? That's asking a lot, given their general overall quality.
Ron threw up his hands. You know what, Malfoy? I don't even care. I don't want anything from you. Not your gratitude, not anything. I didn't save your life because I thought your life was worth saving. That brought Draco up short, but he recovered quickly and said, That doesn't change things. What things? You saved my life, and there are rules in the Malfoy family code of conduct about this sort of thing. I owe you my life. That means I have to stick around and wait for a chance to save your life, or I told you I don't want that. Doesn't matter. The protocols have to be observed. Draco swung his legs over the side of the bed, tested them, and stood up slowly. He was shorter than Percy, so had to be careful not to trip over his pajama bottoms. Reaching out, he picked up the pocket knife Harry had left on the bedside table and flicked it open. Then he tossed it to Ron. Catch, Weasley. Ron caught the knife and looked at him questioningly. Malfoy, what? Draco stood up straight, his shoulders back, and looked directly at Ron. You saved my life, he said again. The Malfoy family code of conduct, Rule 613, clearly states that now I owe you a debt in blood. That means you get one try at me with that knife. Ron looked as if he had walked in on Professor McGonagall taking a bath with Snape. Oh yeah? Well, the Weasley family code of conduct rule number 1 just as clearly states, no chance, you psycho loon. Come on, one try at me. My ancestors used to do this sort of thing all the time. Just throw the knife at me. You don't have to aim in vital areas or anything, but if you manage to nick me, then all debts between us are discharged and I'll never bother you again. Ron looked faintly green. What about one try at you with, same I want, instead of a whacking great knife? Draco shook his head. It has to be blood. Ron stared at him. Then the faintest grin curled the left side of his mouth. Do I have to throw it? Couldn't I just walk up and stick the knife in your throat? Draco didn't bat an eye. If you like, but you miss the intended courtesy of the gesture if you do. You're mental, said Ron flatly. Do you know that? I'm a Malfoy. Ron glanced down at the knife, sighed, and fitted the handle into his hand. Well, he said, if it's tradition. Draco felt a very slight twitch of anxiety. Ron seemed to be holding the knife with a certain degree of intention. Surely he couldn't have misjudged Weasley quite that much. Looking resigned, Ron turned the knife around, took it by the point, and aimed it towards Draco, whose stomach did a slow, rolling flip. Then Ron threw the knife. It whipped past Draco's head, missed him by several feet, and embedded itself in the wall behind him, point first, dead center in Percy's display of old Hogwarts school timetables. Draco looked at Ron. Ron looked back. I seem to have missed, he said. Well, said Draco kindly, it was a very good try. Said Ron thoughtfully, and scratched his ear. Malfoy? What? Is there really a Malfoy family code of conduct, rule 613, that says I get one try at you with that knife? Or was that just for my benefit? Draco looked back at him and grinned. Come to think of it, Rule 613 actually states that members of the Malfoy family who have artificial limbs should not attempt sexual intercourse in the moat. My mistake. Ron shook his head. I had a feeling. Draco looked at Ron and saw that the other boy was looking at him curiously. What? He asked, suspicion tinting the edges of his voice ever so slightly. Ron paused, took a deep breath, and said, I was just wondering, do you play chess? Not lately. Would you like to? I'm not sure staring at that thing like it's going out of style is going to give you any insight, Hermione, said Harry. Hermione looked up from her examination of the lycanthropy and shot him a look. They were both sitting at the kitchen table, Hermione surrounded by books and notes, the lycanthropy lying on a dinner plate in front of her. Charlie glanced over at them curiously from his place by the stove. He had an apron tied around his waist and was stirring a pot of vegetables with a long wooden spoon. "What are you thinking about, Hermione?" he asked.
"This," said Hermione slightly dispiritedly, holding up the lycanthropy. "I've been trying to figure out what it is and what it does, but so far—"
"I've seen that shape," said Charlie, wiping his hands off on a tea towel and walking over to stand by her. "Carved into the sides of trees in the forest. It's old."
"It's supposed to protect travelers against werewolves," said Hermione. "Only, I think it does other things as well."
"Can I see it?" Charlie asked, and held out his hand. Feeling an actual stab of reluctance at the thought of letting it go, Hermione handed it over. Charlie turned it over curiously in his fingers. "Monotum es quod an deri neaquit," he murmured, and it gave off a sudden sharp flash like sparked tinder. "Ow!" Charlie exclaimed, and dropped it back into her hand, looking sheepish. "I guess that didn't work." Relieved to have it back, Hermione smiled at him. "That's okay." At that moment, the cellar door banged open, and Ginny emerged, looking dusty and irritable. Hermione glanced at her.
"What were you doing?"
"Searching the cellar," the other girl replied, shaking the cobwebs from her hair. "Did you find anything?" Charlie asked. She shook her head. "I found Fred and George's magazine collection under a paving stone. And when I say collection, I do mean collection. It was edifying. That cellar is huge," she added, "and it's got all sorts of twisty little corridors leading off every which way." She broke off at the sound of a thunking noise, which turned out to be Ron jogging down the stairs. He came into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator door, took out a carton of milk, and drank out of it. "Ron," said Charlie warningly, flapping his apron. "Sorry," said Ron, and turned to face the others, who were staring at him with identical expressions of rabid curiosity. "What?"
"Did he thank you for saving his life?" Harry demanded. "Not in so many words. He made a speech, I threw a knife at him, and we started playing chess."
They all blinked at him.
"You're joking about the knife, of course," said Harry finally.
"Maybe," said Ron with a half smile. He reached into his pocket and took out the knife and tossed it to Harry, who caught it out of the air and looked at it with a bemused expression.
"So, Draco isn't such an awful git after all, is he?" asked Hermione triumphantly.
Ron rolled his eyes.
"No, he's still an awful git. Now he's just an awful git who owes me 30 galleons. "You played chess with him for money?"
Ron wasn't listening.
"If you fall asleep in the middle of a game, is that a forfeit?"
Charlie looked up.
"He's asleep. Isn't someone supposed to be sitting with him?"
"Not me," said Ron firmly. "I did my turn for the hour. Anyway, I don't think he wants me watching him sleep." Ginny glanced up.
"I'll go up and check on him. Besides, he hasn't eaten anything since yesterday. I'll see if he wants any lunch."
And, brushing cellar dust hastily off her jeans, she vanished up the stairs. Ron looked after her and shook his head.
"I don't get what she sees in him,"
he said grimly, glaring down at his milk.
"You don't know anything's going on between them," said Harry diplomatically. "Maybe they're just friends."
Ron looked over at Charlie, where he stood at the stove.
"What do you think?"
Charlie shrugged. "It's Ginny's business, isn't it?" Ron tapped his finger impatiently on the table, and Harry's shoulders shook with silent laughter.
"You are not being helpful," he said irritably. "What about you, Hermione? Come on, she must have said something to you about Draco." "With all that's been going on lately, is Ginny's love life really the topic you wish to discuss?" she asked primly, not glancing up from her book.
"Well, no," said Ron, coming to stand behind her chair and peering without much interest at her book.
"I'm done reading anyway," she sighed, and pushed the book away,
before leaning against Harry's shoulder. "Dinner's ready," announced Charlie, and as he reached to take the lid off the cooking pot, the porch door banged open, and Salazar Slytherin walked into the house. He was walking a narrow and sparkling bridge between darkness and greater darkness. At each side, the path fell away steeply, so steeply he could not see the bottom of the vast abyss he crossed, nor its farthest end. At the center of the bridge, a man was standing, and when he reached him, Draco saw without surprise that the man had his own face, a few years older perhaps, but no more than a few. He could have been his twin, slender with silver hair, his eyes like pale jewels containing neither passion nor empathy. Draco groaned and covered his face with his hands. "I thought I had gotten rid of you." The other smiled at him. "I almost lost you, it's true. I thought I might have to follow you down to the grey places, but you came back." Draco found the words he wanted to say without searching for them. "Why does it have to be me?" he asked. "There is nothing special about me." "That's a defeatist attitude, boy," said the other, mouth stretched into a malevolent smile. Draco's voice came out on a wail. "What do I have to do to be rid of you?" "Try to destroy me if you like. You will accomplish nothing more than your own destruction." "I don't believe it." Draco lifted the sword in his hand. In this world, it was feather light, and swung it toward the man who faced him, swung it straight and true, meaning to slice him in half. The sword flew, connected. There was the sound of shattering glass. Draco jumped back as the shards of the mirror he had been facing fell around him like snow. He bolted upright in bed, hearing his own harsh gasps for air as if they came from somewhere else. There was a tearing pain in his chest, and he pressed his fist against it, feeling it ebb slowly. His pajamas were drenched in sweat, sticking to him uncomfortably. He swung his legs over the bed, peeling off his pajama top, and his eyes caught a glimpse of light across the room. The sword, propped against the wall where Harry had left it. The light reflecting off the blade had a reddish tinge. Draco closed his eyes. That feeling was back. The feeling of having slept without resting, waking more tired than he had been when he lay down. He wondered if he should write to Snape and ask for more wakefulness potion to go along with the will-strengthening potion. But at the moment he didn't have the energy. He felt overwhelmed by despair and anger. Lying back down on the bed, he pulled the covers up over his head and was about to fall back into nightmares when the sound of Percy's bedroom door being quietly opened caught his attention. He lay still, pretending to be asleep in case it was Ron. Quiet footsteps across the room, and then a hand touched his shoulder. Slowly, he opened his eyes, and Ginny's fiery red hair swam into focus before her face did. "I just came to see if you wanted any food," she intoned quietly. "Charlie made it. It's pretty good. I could bring you up some, or you could come down if you feel up to it." Draco paused for a moment, and then a faint smile flitted across his face. "I feel up to it," he said. Ginny removed her hand from his shoulder, and he was surprised at how the absence of her warmth bothered him. "Shall I tell them you'll be down in a few minutes?" she asked. "Sure. I'll see you all in a bit," said Draco, and Ginny nodded before leaving the room. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard the front door bang open. Alarmed, Ginny sprinted down the rest of the way and came up short as she saw the tall, imposing figure of Slytherin standing in the front door. His dark eyes seemed empty, like hollow shells, and Ginny was struck by how much he resembled Draco. In the sharp lines of his face, the angry curves of his bones. But around his body there surged a kind of energy, menacing and and dark. His cloak was more than black, as it was several shades darker. It seemed to draw in all the light in the room. Above it, his skin was corpse white. A small scream escaped her lips, unbidden, and Slytherin turned his attention from the assembled in the room to her.
"I'll go,"
he said, inclining his head towards her.
"It is good to see you again after so many years. The kindest witch in all the world, and yet, in the end, you betrayed me too."
From where he stood across the room, Ron made a move to go to her, but a sharp gesture from Charlie froze him in place. The movement brought Slytherin's attention back to Hermione.
"Rowena,"
he said, and began to walk towards her. But Harry was on his feet so fast, Ginny barely saw him move. He pushed Hermione behind him, hard, keeping a grip on her arm with one hand, while the other was outstretched in front of him. "I won't let you take her again," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "You'll have to go through me." "And me," said Ron, finding his courage, and stepped up beside Hermione. Charlie, who was standing by the stove, was silent. His hands were balled into tight fists at his side, and his green eyes followed Slytherin's progress across the room with a look Ginny couldn't decipher. Slytherin continued walking towards Hermione as if Ron and Harry had not spoken. Desperate to do something, Ginny reached out to snatch up a chair and vaulted down the last few steps to place herself between Slytherin and Harry. "Don't come near her," she hissed fiercely, holding it between her and the Snake Lord.
"Or what? You'll strike me with that rather cheap-looking piece of furniture?"
he drawled menacingly.
"Go right ahead. You cannot hurt me."
Distantly, Ginny became aware of Hermione fumbling in her pockets for her wand. But then a quiet voice from behind her cut through the tension like a silver knife cutting cloth. "I don't think you quite heard what Ginny said," it said. "She said not to come near Hermione, but then I guess listening isn't one of your strong points." Slytherin paused. The shadows parted, and Draco stepped forward, onto the stairs, moving slowly and deliberately. He had changed out of his pajamas, but his feet were bare, and in his hand was the sword. What is he doing? Ginny thought desperately. He's still weak. But Draco continued down the stairs, as if nothing were wrong, as if his slowness of pace was nothing more than an expression of insolence. He was standing on the bottom of the stair now, close enough that a few more feet would close the distance between him and where Ginny stood. She was still holding the chair. Draco didn't look at her, although he was obviously very aware of her presence. His eyes were fixed on Slytherin. "You came here for me," he said in a clear, quiet voice. "Why don't you let the rest of them go?" Slytherin smiled, and it was much worse than Ginny had thought it would be.
"What makes you think I came here for you?"
Draco paled slightly, and his eyes darted almost imperceptibly towards Harry and Hermione, and she nearly jumped out of her skin in astonishment. Draco had not moved his lips, yet Hermione could have sworn he had suddenly spoken, could have sworn she heard him say urgently to Harry, "Get Hermione out of here." And Harry replied, "Distract him." Draco's pale eyes widened, then narrowed. He looked at Slytherin. "Is the offer Wormtail made me still on the table?" At that, Slytherin seemed tense.
"You refused him,"
said the Snake Lord softly. "My father's dead," said Draco flatly, and raised the sword like a barrier between himself and Slytherin. "As you well know, and as you said, being your heir is why I was born." He had gone very white during this speech, and for a moment Ginny thought that, in fact, he did look very much like Lucius. But when he spoke, his voice was controlled and careful. Slytherin's eyebrows drew together. All his attention focused on Draco, and Ginny saw Harry and Hermione begin to draw towards the door. They moved as silently as possible, not looking at each other, only inching, slowly, towards the exit that led to the garden.
It is what you were born for,
said Slytherin to Draco, his long, spidery fingers clenching and unclenching at his sides.
But your attempts to distract me are actually dangerous.
He raised his hand and several things happened at once. Draco grabbed Ginny and she dropped the chair as he pushed her behind him. Harry stretched out his hand out for the doorknob, and Charlie knocked the pot from the stove to the floor with a resounding crash. Slytherin spun around and saw Harry and Hermione at the door. His hand whipped forward, and a jet of blackish light shot from his palm. Harry and Hermione went careening backwards and hit the wall to double over on the floor. The Snake Lord then took a step, not towards Hermione, but towards Harry this time. With one white hand, he ran the tip of his finger down the side of Harry's cheek.
I killed you,
said the Snake Lord softly.
I watched your blood run out of you and over my hands, and it burned, cousin. And with your dying thoughts, you cursed me.
Harry winced away from Slytherin's touch, his green eyes gone dark, nearly black. I'm not Godric. Slytherin took a hissing breath and dropped his hand.
I know who you are,
he said.
Harry Potter. You killed my basilisk, the first of my children, my creation. If you think my hatred for you is any less than my hatred for your forefather, you are much mistaken. You will die like he did.
Harry raised his chin and spoke then, but it came out on a hiss that sounded like 1,000 slithering serpents. Whatever he said, it struck a nerve with Slytherin. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment he didn't move. Then he raised his hand and hit Harry across the face. The sound was like a whip cracking in the nearly silent room. It galvanized Hermione, and she leapt to her feet, pushing Harry aside and hurtling herself at Slytherin, who smiled at her and raised his hand again. A flash of blue light flew from his fingers, striking her in the chest and knocking her back against the wall. Give me the sword, Harry called out, his voice ringing in Ginny's ears, and Draco's voice. Catch it. Harry raised his hand, and suddenly he was holding the sword, a little awkwardly, but tightly, in his right hand. Ginny saw Slytherin, his face darkening, saw Harry raise the hand with the sword in it, and pause, because Charlie was suddenly standing in the middle of the room, directly between Slytherin and Harry. His arms were crossed, almost as if he were blocking the Snake Lord. Put the sword down, Harry, he said. Harry looked flabbergasted. But Charlie... Harry, he hissed, looking as pale as death, his eyes glittering darkly. You don't know what you're doing. He glanced back over his shoulder at Slytherin, who stood motionless, his eyes full of darting shadows. Put the sword down. Harry hesitated. His eyes flicked to the side, his grip on the sword loosening, and this time Ginny could have sworn that Draco called across the room to Harry, although his mouth did not move, and no one else seemed to hear. Don't do it. But it's Charlie, Harry replied. You can't trust him. Of course I can. Hermione's head suddenly jerked up from the floor where she sat, and Ginny followed her gaze to the clock on the wall. There were the 9 hands that indicated each member of the Weasley family. Percy's hand was on work, Bill's said traveling, and Ron and Ginny's hands were clustered together at mortal peril. But Charlie's hand just said, home. Drop the sword before you get us all killed, repeated Charlie, not taking his eyes off Harry's face. Don't play the hero, Harry. Is it worth Ron's life, or Hermione's, or Ginny's? Harry went white. Don't! Shrieked Hermione, scrambling up to her knees. Don't listen to him, Harry! Harry was breathing as if he had been running. His hands were livid on the hilt of the sword. Charlie, I can't... Charlie lunged at him, knocking Harry back into the wall, his hand outstretched for the sword. Harry looked utterly stunned, twisted sideways, and Charlie leapt back, clutching the sword in his right hand. Hermione heard Ron yell out, "Charlie, no! Don't touch it!" as he flung himself towards his brother, knocking him to the ground. The sword rattled out of Charlie's grasp and skittered away across the kitchen floor, and Charlie shoved Ron off him and scrambled to his knees, reaching out again for the sword. There was a flash of movement, and suddenly Draco was there, grabbing at the sword. But Charlie seized it first and raised it in his hand, calling towards Slytherin. "Master, it is here!" And then there was a flash of green light, brighter than any light Ginny had ever seen, and she heard Hermione scream. And then there was silence. Sunlight came in shades of rose and sapphire, and turned the sky over the Barrow into a mosaic of color. Sirius, however, was in no mood to admire the sky. He had arranged to meet Narcissa some distance from the Weasleys, so they could talk privately for a few moments. When he apparated into the middle of the darkening grove of trees, Narcissa was already there. She came towards him, her hair very silver in the half-light, twilight catching in the folds of her dark red robes. "Everything all right?" he asked, seeing her expression as she tilted her face up for him to kiss. "No, the inquest is horrible. They just don't know what to make of Lucius's death at all, and all his old papers have been dragged out and gone over." She broke off. "Never mind that. How's Remus?" "Still asleep," said Sirius, as they started along the path towards the Barrow. "But there's a spell that I learned during my aura training, which will alert me when he wakes up." "Sirius, I think we'd better bring Draco back to the manor. You can't keep running back and forth between sick rooms. You'll drive yourself round the twist." "I know you're right," he said wearily. "And you know, I had a thought. I don't want to go to the College of Horrors to tell them about Remus, but what about old Mad-Eye Moody? He's a bit of an iconoclast, and he knows more about the history of dark arts than anyone. I'm sure he wouldn't feel like he had to tell the Ministry about Remus." Maybe. You know who else might be able to help?" "Who?" "Severus Snape." "No." "Sirius, don't be stubborn." "I'm not being stubborn. I just said no, that's all." They were coming into sight of the Barrow now, and Narcissa gave an exasperated sigh. "He knows a lot about being cold, you know." "I'm not asking that little rat bastard for anything." "Sirius, don't be thick. I know him. He and Lucius were practically inseparable for years before he left the Death Eaters. He really knows a lot about—" She broke off. Sirius turned to look at her. He caught a single brief glimpse of her face, wide-eyed with horror, staring off, past him, before she screamed. Then she was tearing past him and hurtling down the path towards the Barrow. He spun around in astonishment and froze. No, it can't be. He stood where he was, too stunned to move, his mind already casting itself back 15 years, to another night, to a house with its side caved in as if it had been kicked by a massive foot. The choking cloud of dust and plaster that burned his throat and stung his eyes as he crawled through broken slabs of rubble towards the sound of a baby crying. And over it all, that deathly greenish black cloud, its shape unmistakable. A skull with a serpent protruding from its mouth, its dead black eye sockets filled with stars. The dark mark. And that is all for this chapter, guys. Quotes. Standing on a hilltop during a lightning storm wearing a wetsuit of armor and yelling all the gods are bastards at the top of your lungs is from The Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett. I've come to regard you as someone that I've met is from Red Dwarf. Thank you so much for joining me. Again, if you are enjoying this, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. And I am doing a special on my Patreon for the 12 Days of Christmas, which is December 25th through January 5th. At the $2 mark, I have my own personal Harry Potter fan fiction that I wrote with my best friend when we were but teenagers. That particular little segment will be up for that particular amount of time. So for those that are interested, you can go to my Patreon. It is linked in my About section of my page, and just, give it a listen if you are into Harry Potter fan fiction and you are interested to see what we wrote when we were teenagers. Other than that, I do also have a Ko-fi if anyone is interested in supporting me monetarily. You can check that out in my About section as well here on YouTube. And so again, thank you guys so much. Be sure to check out the Patreon for the dates I listed, and I will see you all in the next one. Good night.